Well, good evening everybody, and thanks to Gavin for the introduction, that's appreciated. As Gavin mentioned, my name is John Davies and I've been involved with the North Herts for Europe ever since its inception actually. Not that I do all that much for it, I wish I did more, but I've been involved in it for a very long time. Now, the origin of this talk this evening was when Gavin Herder spent quite a number of years living and working in Brussels. And Gavin thought that, well, there might be a talk there for the group. So my first reaction to that really was, it was so long ago that it's hardly relevant to the circumstances of today. Just to put a dimension on it, we went to Brussels in 1981, and on thinking about it, that is actually nearer in time to the end of the Second World War than today. And it was half a lifetime ago, so how is that possibly relevant to the problems of today? But I didn't really like to say no, so I gave it a little bit more thought. And then I realised that the time spent in Brussels coincided very closely to the time that Britain was part of the common market. So perhaps, yes, there might be something to talk about there. And I also realised that that particular period, 1981 to 1993, was in effect bookended by some pretty important political developments. Before going to Brussels, there were important things which I'll touch on, and it ended with really quite seismic events of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in Eastern Europe, the end of the Soviet Union, and then in Europe, the Maastricht Treaty, if people remember that, and all the difficulties that with a referendum in various countries and so on. And that resulted in the formation of the European Union as we know it today, a new entity able to sign international agreements with other countries. It resulted in the single market being formed, quite different from the common market. It brought about the concept of European citizenship, which we so lightly waved away in 2016. And paved the way for the euro as well. So Maastricht was really a very, very important event. So going back to 1981, I very clearly remember being on the Dover-Calais ferry one dark autumn night with my wife and two very young children, going off to Brussels. We thought for an adventure, perhaps 2 or 3 years, and then back. Excited but apprehensive as to what it would all work out as, not for one moment thinking that we'd be there for 12 years. So what I'd like to do tonight is just very briefly running through these things, and I'll go through it in a bit more detail, but the fundamental reason for being in Brussels at that time, which was to do with the common market. So perhaps, although I'm sure most people here tonight know all about the origins of the common market, I thought it perhaps useful historical information just to run through very briefly how that came about. Then what it was like actually moving to Brussels, moving into Belgium. There were very good things about, very positive things about being there, and one or two problems as well. Also, the years which I've got there on the screen really correspond pretty closely to the Thatcher years, so all sorts of things going on in this country as well. So that makes context to it. But the reason for being there was to do with a business, and although I don't want to go into bore people with a lot of details of a particular business, but it's perhaps worthwhile just seeing it in the wider European context and the things which we actually did in Brussels with that business. Some quite interesting mergers and acquisitions, a joint venture. And one has to then ask the question, well, was the common market really a benefit to doing that? So I'd like to address that one. And then towards the end of the period, global events, huge changes, start of the European Union, and then I'd just like to, if there's time at the end, just say a few words about the whole issue of immigration and freedom of movement, which remains such an issue today. So the reason for being in Brussels, I've already mentioned the common market, and that's what it was all about. And first of all, I wasn't there in any official capacity at all. I think Gavin perhaps imagined I was doing something very grand and important, like being in the Commission or something official, but no, just working for an industrial company. A large company. It was once this country's biggest company. But there's another story we won't go into tonight, obviously, about deindustrialization in this country. And that company is no longer in existence, no longer with us. Now, my own background is in chemical engineering, and throughout my working life I was involved in technology with engineering, design, production management, those sort of things. Never involved in the commercial side of the business. But commercial colleagues who were also in Brussels at the same time would talk about the different markets that they were selling products into, and traditionally the UK was the domestic market. That was the market which was looked at, perhaps being the easiest, most profitable. Then there was an export market called CWE, Continental Western Europe, which was more difficult, more competitors on the patch. And then, if one wanted to, there was the rest of the world, which was the deep sea export market. So there were all those different markets that people talked about. But then, with the formation of the common market in Europe, the concept of the home market suddenly became the whole of Western Europe. And I can remember the day when word came down from on high, look, we're going to treat now Western Europe as our domestic market. And really, to reinforce this, a decision was made just 2 or 3 years later to relocate one of the businesses to a continental European location, just to concentrate people's minds on that. Lots of discussion about would it be Frankfurt, which might have been better in some ways, but then the decision was made to make it Brussels, which was probably very sensible, certainly for a mainly British workforce that was being moved to Brussels, and the availability of multilingual support staff and so on in Brussels. So it was Brussels. And a small team, about less than 12 people, was located from Wellingborough, the city where the business was being run from, to Brussels. So just a little bit of background to us. It's really just history, and I'm sure, again, people here tonight will know all about this. But the origin of the common market came about from, in fact, work which was going on during the darkest days of the Second World War, when a lot of thought was being given to reshaping Europe once the war was over. And particularly France was very much thinking about how to work with a new Germany, and how, above all, to make a future war impossible. One must remember that France had been invaded by Germany or Prussia 3 times over the last 100 years. And therefore, it was obviously very important something was done about that. And this peace project essentially involved integrating the coal and steel industries of as many countries as possible into a European coal and steel community. And this was, remarkably soon after the end of the war, 1951, the Treaty of Paris, with the 6 countries which remained as these 6 for quite a number of years: France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg and Italy. Now, the UK stood aside from this, which is, to some extent understandable. Britain had never been defeated or occupied in the war. Its industry is still a major industrial country. I think, although it's not checked this, that industrial wages in Britain were about double the level of France. And then, of course, there was the Commonwealth, the Empire, there was the kith and kin in Australia, New Zealand to think about. People in this country really saw that as the future, trade deals with those countries and so on. So Britain stood aside from these developments. The memorable quote was Noyer Bevan, if one remembers him, who said, "The Durham miners will not stand for it." So that was the Treaty of Paris. Then just 6 years later, the ambition became much more developed. The same 6 countries still decided to form the European Economic Community, more commonly called the Common Market. Now again, Britain felt it was not its role to get involved in that. And this was the time when Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, and he is said to have said to an aide, when invited to attend the signing in Rome of the Treaty of Rome, he said, "Tell them I'm too busy with Cyprus." Now, also, the final point there, European Atomic Energy Commission, Euratom, another organisation was set up back under the Treaty of Rome, which inexplicably this country decided to leave in 2016. So what was the common market? I mean, quite simply, it was designed to eliminate internal tariffs between the member countries. There would be no quotas or other barriers to trade, and perhaps also very important, there would be a boundary around the member states, so the external tariffs to all non-members would be uniform. And then, perhaps most important of all, there would be free movement for goods, services, capital and labour, the four freedoms, which often people do not really understand the implications of that. But the common market stood like that for, I think, about 35 years before eventually being overtaken by the single market. I'm going to that in a moment, but common market was quite different from the single market. Now, Britain stood aside from the common market, but in just a matter of 4 years, the country started to think again, hang about, are we sure about this? And applied to actually join the common market in 1961. And Charles de Gaulle was the French president then, and he vetoed Britain's application on the basis that this country was not sufficiently communautaire. And my own feeling is that he was probably right about that. Britain didn't get it, didn't understand the European project as such, thought it of a transactional trade deal, but not committed to it. Again, Britain tried a second time, again vetoed, but before 1973, de Gaulle died in, I think it was 1970, Edward Heath, perhaps the most pro-European of all British Prime Ministers, was in power and applied again in 1973 and was successful, and this country then became a member of the Common Market, the European Economic Community. And that's not quite the end of the story, because there was then a change of government. Harold Wilson came in with the Labour government, and there were really quite strong influences within the Labour Party at the time that this was a rich man's club, essentially, and people were quite suspicious of the effect on trade unions and labour movement and so on. And in order to manage internal party problems, this is perhaps a rather familiar tale actually, Wilson called a referendum in 1975 as an in-out on the common market. And interestingly, all the political parties of the day said we must remain in. Even the press, the right-wing press, was supportive of being in the common market, and over 2/3 of the population voted in favour of staying in the common market, and our membership was confirmed. So, I've already said that the reason for going to Brussels was all about the common market, to take advantage of the common market, try and turn around the fortunes of a relatively ailing business. But of course, on moving into another country, it was a very busy time. One had to rent a house. All the advice was not to buy. One needed a car, choosing school for the children. There were quite a number of international schools, so there was choice there. Not easy for accompanying wives, and I mean, the whole team that was sent to Brussels, they were all blokes, all married with children and so on, so quite a number of people affected. This was before there was any mutual recognition of professional qualifications, so wives, I don't think any of them actually worked in Brussels, so not easy. Then the situation was quite different from this country, where the local authorities in this country haven't a clue who actually lives in their area, but throughout most of Europe, people actually register with their town hall when they arrive in a town. If they move house, they register. That's true of Belgian citizens as well as anybody visiting there. And I've used the French word commune, meaning a district council, essentially. So one would go to the district council and register, be given an ID card, a facilitated driving licence. Then, of course, car insurance matters, health insurance. There's no national health system there, but there was membership of what they were called mutuals, which were sort of insurance companies, I think probably non-profit making. And that looked after the healthcare payment issues, lots of language issues, because most people in this country probably think that Belgium is a French-speaking country. The majority, a small majority, are actually Dutch-speaking. So what language are you going to try and brush up or learn or whatever? Not easy. And certainly no time for any real work while all that was going on. Incidentally, the picture is Waterloo, the battlefield, and we lived for a time quite near there. Now, the common market and its implications of what we were there now, it made it very easy to go into and live in Belgium. There was no need for visas or work permits and those sort of things. I've mentioned that we actually had to register with the commune, same way as Belgian nationals did. ID cards weren't a problem. I mean, I know it's an emotional issue here, but they facilitated all sorts of things like picking up a parcel at the post office or whatever, just showed your ID. But they were administered by quite a helpful, friendly local authority like Gurner Road here, not by an over-centralised and, dare I say, dysfunctional Home Office, as almost certainly would be in this country. And I think that one of the implications of not having registration in this country is we hadn't a clue how many people were here from the European Union in later days. We didn't know where they were, and I think to some extent that contributed to the anti-European sentiment that led to Brexit. Now, the Brussels experience was a very exciting time, new city to explore, learning about the history of the place and so on. Quite fascinating history, how Belgium's a fairly new country, formed in 1830. I was just going to mention, one of the theatres in the middle of Brussels, the Monet, or Lult, was where a sort of revolt started in 1830, and then it spread to get independence from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands that ruled Brussels and Belgium in those days. But so many other things, good food, restaurants, good public transport, metro and trams in Brussels and so on, higher standard of living, lots of exciting places to visit nearby. Antwerp, this picture shows part of Antwerp with its cathedral in the background. Easy shopping destination on a Saturday, living in Brussels and so on. In many ways a more pleasant place. Bruges, the Ardennes. Another advantage, of course, on the, if you like, the right side of the channel, one could go on foreign holidays without the hassle of a cross-channel ferry. So one could be in, perhaps at a very early start, but one could be in Switzerland by lunchtime. So quite a number of advantages. And just going back to those days, no mobile phones, one went off on long car journeys with no phone to phone for assistance or anything like that. TV was by cable ahead of this country. And lots of foreign language channels on the cable, but no BBC. And remember the day the kids came home from school to say the BBC is coming on the cable. So much excitement there. And of course it's all before the Channel Tunnel, no high-speed rail, but very good connections from Brussels Airport all around the place. And I remember there was a frequent travel on the 755 from Zaventem to Manchester to do a day's work in Cheshire and then back to Brussels in time for bed. So that was all going on there. The wider context, I mentioned Margaret Thatcher was more or less the same period, 79 to 90. The Falklands War was quite horrifying, living there while all that was going on, and the troubles in Northern Ireland. A lot of Belgian colleagues and people we met socially were very pro-British in many ways, had a soft spot for Britain, but thought, how could a country they liked be involved in all those problems? And I remember explaining to a group, about the history of Northern Ireland, and just didn't know the background to those things. But of course there were problems in Belgium as well. The language difficulties between Dutch-speaking and French-speaking Belgians overflowed into conflict, and clearly remember barbed wire barricades in the middle of Brussels and really quite threatening looking, heavily armed police in attendance and so on. And there were some very bad things at the time as well. I mean, probably people in this country are not aware of it, but there was a spate of supermarket shootings in Belgium at that time. 28 people, including children, were killed, so it took the gloss off supermarket shopping. And of course the Herald of Free Enterprise, a ferry which had often been on, rolled over off Zeebrugge in 1987, and almost 200 people died in that. And if it had been a week or so later, to coincide with the British school half-term, you would have almost certainly known people involved in that. So it wasn't all sweetness and light there. Now, very brief word about the business that we were sent to Brussels to be involved in. This was a plastics business, making it from the basic raw materials. And you can see from the picture, this is large-scale petrochemical type plant, handling large quantities of hazardous materials, highly flammable liquefying gases, highly toxic materials, needed very high operational standards to keep it safe. And of course this was not going on in Brussels. We didn't have any plants in Belgium for that matter, but certainly not something you could just do on a light industrial estate. Then the materials being made in the previous slide then fed through into making the actual polymers, white powder. This is just a small part of a polymer production plant. And the product was a white powder sold in bulk in road tankers or in rail tank cars, used for a whole range of quite long life applications, which are absolutely vital. Pipes, cable insulation, stationery, film, foils, packaging, bottles, all sorts of things like that. Wide range of things. But the business experience, Brussels was chosen for the location to strengthen the market position. We had at the outset just 2 manufacturing sites in Britain, in the northwest of England, a brand new state-of-the-art plant in Germany which just opened, and it still was not a European scale business. And I suppose the mission was to try and create a European business out of this. And we acquired a business in the UK and South Wales, that was taken on. Then a business in Switzerland, we got a polymer manufacturing plant south of Zurich and another plant in Germany. But then in the mid-1980s, there was a big one when we did a deal with the state-owned Italian petrochemical company and acquired 5 major plants, all the way from the north to south actually, and on Sardinia as well. And this made a joint venture which was, well, I say here number 1, I think it was 1 equal in Europe in this particular business. So in interesting, challenging times, particularly on mergers and acquisition issues. Could it be done from the UK? It probably could, but the Italian element, probably not. But certainly the common market was quite central to enable all that to be done. Then, really at the end of the time that I'm talking about, November 89, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that was a memorable experience. Perhaps we felt nearer to it in Brussels and people in this country, but people were glued to the television sets as that was happening. Quite remarkable scenes. And of course the countries in Eastern Europe gradually threw off the shackles of the previous rulers, and by the end of 1991 the Soviet Union came to an end. And that opened up business opportunities in Eastern Europe with acquisition potentials and so on. So that was one hugely important sort of development. The other one was the Treaty of Maastricht, which formed the European Union, concept of European citizenship, single currency and a single market, started January 93. So very important things at the time of leaving Brussels. At that time, the business was changing, and there were plans afoot to make it into a more freestanding business. Some things I found not particularly attractive. family circumstances, the children were both back in this country at university, and that meant I used to do the trip from Brussels to university location and back to Brussels in a day. And when you think 2 kids, 3 university terms a year, that was a lot of travelling backwards and forwards. So we just felt the time had come to draw stumps and get back to Britain. But actually I didn't part on bad terms with the company, and went on doing things with them for a number of years, including looking at the Eastern European acquisitions, did assessments of plants in East Germany and Poland and Hungary, and one of them actually went through to an acquisition after my time. Channel Tunnel opened in May '94, so visiting Brussels became a lot easier. I just couldn't resist putting up what it actually cost and compare that with HS2, which is one of my hobby horses. But then you have to ask yourself, was running a business from Brussels a success? And yes, I mean, we showed it could be done. We did those acquisitions, making it a much larger business, overcome perhaps problems of merging cultures and so on into a single organisation. But one has to say, at the end of the day, for a business which needs to be a lean and hungry operation to be successful, putting into Brussels is another layer of costs and bureaucracy, which really undermined what we were really wanting to do to make it a success. So I think that, it's a mixed success with some real quite significant drawbacks. Then what became of it? Well, after my time, it was floated on the market for sale, and first of all in a small way, and then they took control, was Jim Ratcliffe's organisation. Now, people might have heard of Jim Ratcliffe through his part ownership of Manchester United and his recent rather inappropriate statements about the effect of immigrants on this country, when he himself, of course, is a tax exile in Monaco, and perhaps he even thinks of himself as an immigrant in Monaco, who knows. But he took over the business, very, very focused on cost savings and making businesses effective, taking out levels of management, closing down non-performing assets and so on. But the business, which was in Brussels, is no longer run from Brussels, quite obviously, and parts of it still exist. So that's what became of it. And that really is all I want to say about living and working in Brussels during the common market times. But I think that really just prompts a little bit of an afterthought. I mean, perhaps this was particularly at the time of the 2016 referendum. One heard vox pops on the television and so on, people saying, I was happy with the common market, but I never voted for a European superstate. And of course, people just didn't realise, in saying that the common market was based on the 4 freedoms, including the freedom of movement. They just didn't understand that. And of course now, any thought of rejoining the single market or getting back into the European Union requires acceptance of freedom of movement. And very unfortunately in this country, the government statistics and attitude of the press and so on counts all movement as immigration. Now, in many ways, immigration is the movement of people from often poorer, faraway countries who want to permanently settle. And movement under freedom of movement is more often people coming to learn a language for a couple of years, perhaps students, seasonal fruit pickers, all those sort of things. And those people do not really measure up to what most people regard as immigrants. Certainly, I've asked around quite a bit on this one, and those of us in Brussels at the time and other people know elsewhere, we never thought of ourselves as immigrants in Brussels. We thought of ourselves as expats or Brits abroad, but never as immigrants. And I've actually asked 1 or 2 friends, and certainly a German friend, about what language they would use for movement within the EU, and they've said, well, immigranten would mean immigrants from poor countries wanting to settle permanently in Germany and not go back home. But for people from other European countries coming in for a time, they'd say they're Einwanderung, or the other way, Auswanderung, different language for European movement compared with real immigration. And I think for as long as we lump the whole thing as immigration, it's going to be quite difficult to get people to accept freedom of movement. And my argument is the benefits of freedom of movement, to let British people be able to study abroad, work abroad, retire, all those things. We really want people to say, we want our freedom of movement back. And then it might be possible to get that closer arrangement with the single market or the European Union that we want. Thank you very much.